So, what do you want to talk about defects-wise? You lead us off.
Lead you off.
Straight in the defect.
Okay, so I guess there's a lot of defects showing in buildings now, not just the old buildings, but the newer buildings, which is where I'm probably spending the bulk of my time in defects. And I think the first thing we need to do is identify defects and identify them early. Because as soon as you start identifying defects, you can guarantee that it grows. So you might start with a leak in the garage, for example, and it'll grow. There'll be cracks here, or there'll be windows that aren't fitting right, or there's something with your sliding doors or things like that, which individually don't seem like much, but when you start putting them all together, it starts to build a picture.
Whose responsibility do you think it is to identify those defects? And it probably depends on the size of the building, eh?
Yeah, it does. I mean, if you've got a building manager there, they'll often identify things because they've got the experience with the building. But in the smaller buildings, it's often owners who will identify defects and bring them to the body corporate manager. But generally, it's the building manager who will see something and go, "Oh, that's not quite right. I've experienced that before, so we need to look into it further."
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, it's one thing to identify these defects, but then, you know, what do you actually do? Who do you tell? Like, who's your next port of call? Say, as a building manager, who would you recommend that they go to?
Well, first of all, I think go to your body corporate manager, because a lot of body corporate managers have got a lot of experience dealing with the defects, and they will have people that they work with. So for myself, I have a group of people that I constantly go to because I trust them. I know that they're not going to run away with costs. I've got legal people that I use routinely because I trust their judgment, and experts that you just know that are going to do a good job for the body corporate.
You do end up gathering a bit of a team, eh? Because you see these same people sort of, you know, at all these buildings and AGMs and stuff, when they start talking about especially weather tightness, you get to see the same companies or the same types of people around the table.
Yep.
You know, and I guess it's its own little industry within an industry, isn't it?
It is, and you know, from my point of view, there's good and bad in the industry. And when you've dealt with quite a few building remediation issues, like I have, you tend to weed out the ones that you trust and the ones that you know are good and will give good advice, and will be cost efficient. Because let's be fair, when there's defects identified, it's the owners who suffer.
Yeah.
And also, you know, the value in the building drops instantly as soon as defects are realised, and so you've got to be cognizant of that. So you want people that are going to work quickly as well to try and rectify what needs to be rectified.
Yeah. Roger, do you guys set up your team to be able to, you know, do you have like a specialist person that deals with defects, or are account managers basically having to, you know, do the whole lot?
Yeah. Yeah, our specialist manager is sitting to the left or right of me, depending on which way you're looking at it. Yeah, that's Wendy.
Yeah.
Wendy's got a lot of experience in it. I don't have a lot of experience in it in regards to recent stuff. When I started back in the industry back in 2003 and that sort of stuff, there was the Cove Kinrocks of the world, and then it's gone into Maynard Marks, and I don't know even though I think they're still around, but I don't have a lot of defect. Leaky building or huge remedial stuff that I'm dealing with. So yeah, the answer to the question is that it has to be a senior manager, someone that has a lot of experience and the ability to walk through with people a process that most of them haven't been through, and it's attacking their largest assets.
Because I mean, you become an expert, I guess, over time in dealing with these things. You know, it's just experience that you accumulate along the way. Do you remember like your first go at defects?
Yeah, do I ever? It's a sink or swim scenario.
Yeah.
Luckily, I took it over from somebody, a body corporate manager who left, who'd done a little bit of the groundwork. And at that stage, the company that I was with had a very good weather-tight remediation specialist. And so I learnt a lot from her, but every project is so different that you could never say you know it. You know the processes, like I know the processes, I can walk owners through a process, and I can bring the right people into the job, but everyone is completely different and has its own unique issues that you have to deal with.
So a good time to talk about that process then. So once the defect's been identified, we go and tell, say, the body corporate manager or the committee, and then how does it pan out after that?
All right, so I've made a few notes because there is
Yeah.
there is a bit of a process. So, I mean, instantly we need to identify the age of the building. And that will determine whether or not we're able to have any legal action against anybody, or if we've got some claim on any person that was involved in the build of the building. So, you know, generally we all know that 10-year time frame. So once you get past the 10 years, you're pretty useless at having anyone to claim on, because you've gone past that long stop sort of 10-year time frame.
And that 10-year time frame, is this to do with the council liability, or what is that 10-year time frame about? Do you know?
Well, it's in the Companies Act.
Right.
So it's a 10-year time frame in the Companies Act.
Right.
And so that's what we work to. And generally a lot of the thing that will change that is if there are building warranties that overarch over that time frame. So one I've got at the present time, it has a 15-year weather tightness warranty, so over and above the 10 years. So we've still got a claim on the developer and the construction company because we've got that 15 years.
From a new business point of view, you kind of think these developers are on the hook for so long. You know, like why? It's a surprise that they sort of like keep doing what they do. Eh? Like, you know, they're on the hook for a long time these days.
Yeah, well, they've always been on the hook for 10 years. So my understanding is it kicks off from CCC when the date of the 10-year period is. And Wendy's correct that back in the early days, if you've got a remediation site, when I started with a portfolio of 30 body culverts and 6 of them were leaky, and so there was a sharp learning curve. But with new builds, mostly the defect process is a lot of minor stuff. The major stuff, if it is going to turn up, is going to turn up later on. So it's weather tightness issues and that sort of stuff. Most of the defecting at the start is completely different to what Wendy's talking about, and that is it's just the finish of the building and that sort of stuff in the common areas, in which you would well be aware of with the building management side of the company.
Yep. Back to your process. Keep going through.
Well, actually, I was just going to add to what Roger said there. Part of what building managers and body corporate managers, but particularly building managers at the start, they need to look at the manuals for the buildings and what the maintenance processes are that are outlined from the developer, and we need to stick to them. And we also need to be very cognizant of the LTMPs, what's in the LTMPs, and constantly monitoring them. Because one of the things that could jeopardise any claim that you may have, even if it's under 10 years, is if you've not maintained the building to the standards that you have to maintain it to, because otherwise, if you just haven't done what they've said, they'll come back and say, well, it's a maintenance issue, you haven't maintained it.
Yeah, and those operating manuals can be quite intimidating. You know, they're quite thick in these big bound folders and things, and I know that a lot of people will just put them in the corner and you know, they'll gather dust and they're there if they're needed, but they're super important to be familiar with, because like you say, it runs through, like say, the care of a particular element in the building, and you've got to wash it this often, you've got to repaint it this often or whatever, and if you don't do that, like you say, when it comes to, you know, a defect, you could be on the hook for that. So yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And the other thing is check the manuals and make sure that they're actually relevant to the building. So, you know, currently I have one and it's got all these manuals and warranties, but a lot of the warranties, they're not pertinent to what's actually in the building. So, you know, you need to do that right at the start and just make sure that all of those things actually relate to the building and the systems that are in place in the building.
Well, so where is that breakdown occurred then, if they're not actually relevant to what's in the building?
I think it's a cut and paste warranty.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really relevant to the
Right.
actual building. So,
Okay.
you know, it might be relevant to the building that they utilised to formulate the next manual, but yeah, they've missed bits. So, I mean, that's unusual, but obviously it happens.
Yeah, similar to like long-term maintenance plans. We've seen that with long-term plans as well, the old cut and paste plan. But yeah, keep going with you.
Keep going.
Yeah, keep
Oh,
going.
rightio. Okay. So I think the other thing too is to be cognizant of your warranty and guarantee periods. So, you know, sometimes they're between 3 and 5 years. They could be 2 years. So make sure that you're watching that all the time, and that if you've got any issues, that you notify them within that guarantee period. And the sooner you can notify your issues, the better it is. So Whether you do it legally or just as a body corporate committee, you make a list of the issues and you notify that to the developer and or the constructors and or council, or any of the parties that could be liable for the defects that are presented. A lot of the times, one particular one that I'm dealing with at the moment, their construction is not according to the specifications or the design plans. So we're whole new roof on 2 buildings. That just, it shouldn't have happened because they're just not constructed according to the plans. So council would be on the hook for that, but ultimately the constructor is on the hook. Because they didn't build according to the specifications.
Do you think you get more of these defects around times when there's a building like a boom and people are just so flat out, like the inspections probably don't happen when they should or to the standard that they should? Because remember, like when all these sort of leaky buildings popped up during the early 2000s, they were built, like mid to late 90s, and that was a bit of a building boom time. Do you think that that's one of the issues here, is that these things aren't being sort of checked off as thoroughly as they could be during that phase?
Yeah, I think buildings are so complicated, so much gets missed in the mix that I don't want to seem negative, but I feel like the council, my experience is that they're facing the same situation, that their inspectors are facing such complicated building matters, and they're turning up these inspectors on sites and not really knowing what they're doing. I'm sure they're doing the best they can, but there are times when you're going to miss something, and that seems to be the case on this particular building that Wendy's talking about now, where you can't miss the fact that the whole roof is different to how the plan was. But again, how much time does the inspector spend on time checking all this? Their job would be a nightmare, the council inspectors, to say something good about them, because they're relying on really honesty of the construction company. Yeah. And if the construction company project manager is missing things, then they're missing things, and that extrapolates out to you end up with an issue. And it wouldn't be an issue if it wasn't causing problems. No one would ever have known that this building in particular had an issue, but it's because it's failed, or starting to fail really is more correct in this instance, then that's how it comes about. Otherwise we would never know, the owners would never know. We're not structural engineers, we're not building, so
I guess if there's say 1,000 building sites in Auckland at one time, and there's only say 20 inspectors, and they've only got so much time in the day and all that sort of thing, they're bound to miss something.
Oh, absolutely, because we did a very simple renovation on our house. Well, we tore off the back of the house and rebuilt a new addition on the back. And my experience with the council inspectors during that time is the first inspection they turned up with, and they had no idea what they were even inspecting. It was the first inspection, foundation inspections, and he was unclear about what he was there to look at. And so, I imagine they're under the pump. They've got trainees, new guys starting. And it's 20 years of experience to pick all these things up, and
and there's not always a consistency of inspectors. Like somebody will leave, you'll get a different inspector for the second or third inspection,
that's
so there's no consistency in it.
In the build that we did on our house, every inspector was a different one, so there was no consistency. In fact, the last inspection, which was the final sign-off, he turned up and said that we hadn't had the plumbing inspection, and I said, well, we're finished. That was all done way back. And he went on his not a laptop, but he had like a Chromebook, or what do you call those little things that you used to have in the, and he said, no, none of these are recorded. And I said, well, here's the documentation saying that they've all been signed off. So I think it's systems breakdown at the council.
There's a lot of that going around when they had the super city. Our systems have been updated and we've lost all this information. It's like, that's not our problem.
No.
We've had similar things as well with different renovations and stuff, where you get a different person every inspection, and they end up going back to the start, and it's bloody frustrating. Yep. They try and pick a different set of eyes every time, and they try and pick up something different every time. It's like, hang on, you're not even actually looking at the list of defects. You're just adding to it, and prolonging extending the process. We had one guy came and all he did was look at our smoke alarms. I was like, well, the renovation's down there, and you're looking at smoke alarms throughout the rest of the house.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you have a quick whinge to them and they soon get on with it.
No, it's their job.
Yeah.
I'm sure people hate us just as much.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're the ones that can get in a bit of trouble. So, yeah, keep going with it. We need to.
Okay, so I guess once you've identified that you've got issues and you've identified the relevant parties, or let them know exactly what's going on with what you've identified, and never make it a complete list. Say that this, as we know it now, these are the issues that we've identified. So don't never close your book, because there could be a lot more hiding once you start getting into the sort of process of looking at fixing them.
Okay.
Totally different building. We've identified some leaks in the garage. Where are they coming from? They've got a wet wall system, so you expect a bit of water, but it's more water than we thought. Concrete inspections, and all of a sudden we're finding that there's not enough reinforcement in the concrete, nowhere near enough. And these are newish buildings, like they're under 5 years old. So you would think we shouldn't be seeing these issues, but this is now where I'm seeing more issues than in the older buildings, because most of those, we know they're weather tight, they're chili bin houses or whatever. We know they're weather tight, sooner or later it's going to happen.
That saying where they say they don't build them like they used to. It's kind of true, isn't it?
Yeah. But and they're not. These are not cheap apartments. They're not apartments that you buy for $400,000-$500,000. They're multi-million-dollar apartments. So
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So once we've done that, get a building report. So that the body corporate, it's really important that the body corporate own their own information. So they need to get a full building report or a building condition report. What they've got to understand is once they've got that, it's discoverable, it's on file, and they're never going to get rid of it.
Does it go on the limb?
Yes, it generally would go on the limb, but it's also now under the Unit Titles Amendment. So as of the 9th of May this year, we have to disclose everything in a S146 or a pre-contract disclosure statement.
So if it's discovered, then it's public information.
And the committees have to be very aware that they keep their owners informed, and they disclose any reports that they've got, whether they're draft or in complete format, to their owners as soon as they possibly can.
It seems like a lot of admin work, for additional admin work for all these body corp managers out there.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are looking forward to the new disclosure regime. I mean, we're already working on it. But I mean, I've got a $48 or $46 million weather-tight project on the go, and to disclose every committee meeting for 3 years, every document tabled at those committee meetings, every AGM, EGM, every report on that building. I mean, it's massive. Like some of these reports are, 600-700 pages long. How do you put that in an email format? So,
not to keep bashing the council, but just do what they do, and they put all their files onto one disc, all unlabelled. They're like, here you go, here's your property file.
I love those. When you go get the property file, and it's all like number 7.4.
Yeah, 6,000 pages to look through.
There's thousands of files, and it's like, good work, good luck.
So even getting these documents out. So what the government has tried to do in the revision of the Unit Titles Act is try to give people more disclosure on what the buildings are that they're purchasing. But they seem to have gone to the opposite extreme. So previously it was just, has it been a weather tightness issue or notified through the weather tight homes. But they've seemed to have gone to the other extreme now, where how do you get 100 megabytes or gigabytes of reports to... You're overloading purchases with so many reports that no one's going to read it, to be fair.
In reality, all they want is a summary. They just want a summary. They want to know, in a nutshell, this is what's wrong with the building and how much is it going to cost me.
Has it been remediated? Or is it still to be remediated?
And I think the thing for committees too, which is really hard now, is their liability if they don't disclose. So, I mean, we take a lot of responsibility around that, but they've got to understand now there's a lot of committees that will get a draft report and they'll sit on it. They'll go, it's only in draft format, so, I don't have to disclose it. But that draft report is owned by the body corporate, not by the committee. So they do have to disclose it, and they do have to make owners aware that they've got it.
Okay. Different process for that, for like say a weather tightness issue, because I guess we're talking about not every defect is a weather tightness issue, isn't it? So is it a similar process and similar findings in that for a weather tightness issue from your point of view?
exactly the same. You go through the same formatted process really with everything. I mean, even the massive weather tight ones, it's just the same thing on a bigger scale really. Yeah.
And you find the weather tightness ones tend to be a much larger project, like it's essentially the whole thing, whereas some defects might just focus on a certain part of the building potentially.
Yeah, but they're just as complex in a lot of ways. Like you'll get something like these roof replacements that we're talking about. You know, the owners don't want the building covered. They don't want it shrink wrapped because they don't want to identify that their building is an issue building. So there's, you know, even with this, that's not small, but even with the smaller defects, you've still got all of the same issues to go through, whether it's a complete reclad or whether it's just, you know, identification and repair of smaller defects. It's the only thing with the big ones, of course, is everybody has to get out of the building, so you're vacating it completely, and it could be empty for 2 or 3 years.
Where do you think the emotions for these owners and people that live there, where do you think that those start to really ramp up? Because I mean, I guess what we're talking about mainly here is like the discovery phase and like, you know, finding the information and stuff. But then once it's confirmed that they do have a massive problem and that it's going to be a massive amount of money, you know, that would change their thinking pretty quickly, wouldn't it? And I guess people would become a lot more emotional and invested at that point, probably. Or what do you find?
Yeah, it's a horrible thing to go through, and as somebody who deals with these people day in, day out, it's heartbreaking. I mean, you're watching elderly people who've got a small unit that's their retirement investment. It's their only other income, and they might have bought at the top of a market, and all of a sudden they're $600,000-$700,000 apartments worth $180,000. And then you'll get the others who it's their home. It's their only place that they've got to live, and they've got to move out, and then they've got to pay rent somewhere else, and they've got to find the money to fund the project. And in some cases, like I'm billing up to $500,000-$600,000 an apartment for a fix on a building. So if you haven't budgeted for that, you know,
who budgets for that?
You're screwed, really.
No one can budget for that. No. The simple answer to that question is, how do people get more emotional? Is when their wallet has been attacked.
Yeah.
You know, we've all had arguments with our kids over, you know, misusing the toothpaste and spreading it all over the kitchen, you know, the bathroom, or pumping the body wash all out in the shower because you wanted some bubbles. So when people's wallets are attacked, that's when they become emotional by far.
And you think is it mainly anger, or are people confused, or like what do you think is the main emotion? Scared.
Absolutely scared.
To blame.
How can we do this?
Yeah. Who can we blame? How can we get some money out of people to help cover our costs? And you've got a building that's 18, 20, 24 years old. They've got nowhere to run. There's nowhere to go. So you've either got to sell it at a loss, or dig in and try and make it work for you and come out the other end. And then you get a lot of investors buying in, so they'll buy in at cheap, you know, really cheap. Sometimes they'll buy, 10 units in a block. As soon as you've got that confirmed price, as close as you can get it. I've got one with 155 units, and I would say this year, in the last probably 12 months, we've probably turned over between 70 and 80 of the 155 units. Wow. And we're 4 years into the project now. So
shoot, that's a lot, eh? That's staggering. Again, more admin for you guys, and because you've got to process all the behind the scenes stuff that no one really sees.
Yep.
And so at some point you'd have to have an EGM, right? You can't just wait for depending on the timing, I guess you could wait for an EGM, but an EGM would be a pretty very interesting case to put forward to people to say, this is what the problem is, this is how much it's going to cost. But you don't look forward to EGMs like that.
Well, to be honest, I try not to do an EGM straight up. I try and run owner information evenings so that people can speak freely. We're not necessarily minuting it. I'll generally record it and send it to anybody who couldn't make it.
Yep.
But it's informal. It's not minuted. It's just informing them of what's going on, so that you're taking the emotion out of an EGM when you get to it, because people are informed, they've had a chance to talk about it, they've had a chance to ask questions. And so by the time you get to an EGM and you're either raising a partial budget to further the project or whatever it is, or agree to a Section 74 or cost apportionment or whatever your EGM's for, they will generally know everything that's going to be on that agenda before we walk into the meeting.
And it's usually about, the main thing's about the money, right? So how do these people, once they're lumped with this special levy or this remediation levy, how do they actually go about getting the funds? Like, I mean, not everyone has 500 grand sitting in the bank account, you know, so what are people's options at that stage?
Well, a lot of them want the body corporate to fund it for them and pay them back over a period of time, but it's not that simple. I mean, bodies corporate there are funding options for bodies corporate now, and one of mine is using one of these financing options. It comes from Australia, but they're only raising enough money to cover contingencies if people don't pay the levy. So basically it's up to the owner. I mean, you go to your bank, you get a mortgage, you get your unit valued now and what it's going to be valued at after the remediation to back up your, what you're trying to raise. But a lot of people just can't raise it. If they've got a big mortgage to start off with and then they're going to add this on top, they're in negative equity. So they have to sell. It's up to the owners to raise their own money.
Yep. And that's usually not the only levy that they'll have to, because I've never seen one of these remediation projects come in on budget on time. They usually go over budget and over time quite considerably. That's another massive sort of issue for people as well, because you get people that are having to seek alternative accommodation or whatever you. They've got to extend their mortgage again or find some more money to finish it off. What's your sort of your opinion on these remediations that it's going to cost this much and then all of a sudden it costs that much plus another 50% or whatever? It always seems to happen. It's like these bloody renovation shows where they say, oh, how much did you go over budget? It's like an expectation, eh? Like, yeah. What's the story with that?
So it's an interesting one. Like I've been involved in them where they've gone well over budget, but now tend to go down a path where you investigate. So it might take 4 or 5 years to get to the stage where you're ready to start construction work, because you'll have done destructive testing, you'll have building reviews, you'll have done more, you've gone to your QS, your PMs, your construction people. Another thing that people aren't looking at now, and that adds huge amounts to your cost, is traffic control.
Oh, yeah.
So traffic control is massive if it's a central city block. Your scaffolding, your shrink wrap, all that sort of thing. So most of my projects now take a lot of time to get started. Owners have masses of time. They know approximately how much they're going to be up for. The Section 74s are in place. And hopefully if you've done your work well enough, you should come in, and if you've got enough contingency built into your budget, so almost 25% of some of these budgets is contingency, then you should be able to come in, if not on time, but at least within budget.
Yeah.
Would you say, Wendy, that the industry's changed a bit in how remediation is approached in regards to taking on a lead contractor? So back in my day, last big remediation I did was in 2017, and they prior to that, you would often get 3 quotes from 3 different contractors. Well, you imagine the amount of work that's involved in quoting. A whole lot of it has to go into unknowns, the costs. And in those days, there were massive overspends because so much was put into, I forget what the industry calls it, a particular type of thing, like the extras and that sort of stuff is the layman's term. But nowadays, they seem to be going more for, and this is why we sort of get more better results in regards to overspend and that sort of stuff. They choose one contractor, and then that contractor knows he's going to get the job, and therefore he will allocate his staff more time to find out what are all the potential costs and that sort of stuff. Whereas you're getting 3 guys to just put in a wild ballpark, never knowing if they're going to get the job. Would you say that's more the case nowadays?
Yeah, well, a lot of the time now we don't even go out to tender, maybe to 2 people. Most of the construction companies won't tender unless they're 99% sure that they're going to get the job, because there is so much involved in it. In fact, one I've got starting in February, we still haven't appointed a contractor, and it's a big, but like a very big job. But we've got everybody else in place. The architects are working on the final design, the project managers involved, dealing with everything. We've got a contractor in mind who knows that they're in mind, so that they've got the time aside. We've got everybody in place, and I always try and work with an owner representative. So I'll bring in, right at the very start, I'll introduce them to an owner representative. A guy that I use a lot is Harry Dillon from Saltire Consultants. What he doesn't know about remediation projects and timelines and how to put things together, it's not worth writing. You could write it on a stamp, what he doesn't know. And so I tend to put him in the mix, and he looks after the interests of the body corporate, and he's not allied to the contractors. So he will advise them on contractors, he'll advise them on, and he's constantly in the market, he's dealing with buildings all the time. And so I tend to put somebody like that in the mix, and that makes things go a lot smoother, because committees aren't experts. Your contractors are all there for, to obviously everyone's there to make a profit, but he's not on a fixed term contract, so he just works for them for as long as they need it, and he'll advise them on all aspects of it, including the hiring of contractors. And that's a nice way to go. So by the time you get up to hiring your actual construction company, you've got everything. There's everything there. So the quoting process should be a lot simpler. It should be a lot more accurate. You've got all of the detailed design. You've got all your glazing, everything's in place. So they're quoting on a very firm document.
You mentioned all those different contractors and industry and people and experts and things that start to get around these projects. Who would generally be the first port of call? As a body corporate, they've figured out they've got some defect issues. They know that there's an issue. Who's the first usually, or who are the first people that they'd get around the table?
So from me, I get the owner representative in there straight away. And then
so that's a member of the committee, someone on the committee.
No, an owner representative, independent.
Sorry, like the guy you were just talking about.
Owner rep.
Right. Yeah.
Get him in place, and then get a building survey company in place to do the building survey for you, and then it sort of flows from there. So the owner representative will be able to put a budget together to start things off, so that you can quantify exactly where you are, what you're going to need, how big this is. He can also help a lot with, is there anybody culpable who we can have a go at? Can we have a crack at council even though we're out of time? Things like that. And that's where I go back to notifying your defects to as many people that could be culpable early in the piece, to make sure that you're in there before the end of the 6-year jeopardy period, or the 12-month guarantee right at the start, or your 10-year long stop. So you've got to notify as early as possible. Yeah.
And then at what point do they actually press go on it? Like, do these big sort of like construction companies and that, do they have to be paid a certain amount up front, or how's the money gathered in? Like all these little things that I guess we don't either think about or know. When does the money start flowing in from the owners to the contractors?
So if I can, I'll probably use one that I've got. The one I've talked about, it's starting on the 1st of February. That's when we're looking at construction. So we've got a Section 74 going into place. We're right at the end of our final design, our architectural design. Our quantity surveyor has nailed the cost down and said, yep, we're certain that that's where we're going to be. Our contingency's a little less than it was, but it's still decent. We've got our project manager in place, so we will have an EGM as soon as we've got the Section 74 in place to resolve the raising of the levies. And the owners are always told, especially when I'm looking after anybody, they must pay everything at the start. So they're saying, can we just pay it in sections? Can we, just maybe a bit now and a bit in 6 months, or a bit more in a year? No, we need all the money in place right at the start. And so we generally would make the levies due about 2 months prior to the start of construction, and that way we can identify if we've got issues with people not paying, which could affect the start time of the project.
Shit, so everyone's got to come up with that money right before the...
Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise it falls over real fast, because people can't afford it, and then the whole thing grinds to a halt. Wendy, what would be worthwhile is the parameters, like a brief explanation of the parameters of what a Section 74 is, and how that empowers banks and people to be able to get finance.
Yeah, so there's a few bits and pieces with the funding. Number one is escrow accounts. So often a bank will lend money but they won't want it held by anybody else. They'll want it held by a lawyer who is their escrow agent, who holds that money and then feeds it out to us as and when we need it.
Right.
Sorry, Roger, you said the parameters on...
Like Section 74,
Section 74.
what that establishes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a Section 74 is a High Court order, and it binds all owners to the project and any future owners.
Yep.
So if a unit changes hands part way through, the Section 74 is binding on future owners as well as current owners. It also delineates who pays for what. So a lot of the time the funds are raised via utility interest, so the way we would raise normal levies according to their ownership interest in the building. But sometimes there are private areas that will be charged separately. So a Section 74 will determine how each unit pays and how much it pays. It will determine if there's any monies left over at the end of the project, how they are dispersed, and it binds owners to the project. It also gives the body corporate a lot more power when it comes to debt collection. So it's a really worthwhile tool for a big project, and it just binds people.
That's an interesting one about where the funds are kept. Because I was thinking, do you guys just keep them in your trust account, or who keeps it? Who keeps hold of the funds? So, but that escrow thing is not used on every project. When do they decide whether it's an escrow project or not?
So the banks determine that. So the bank will have a requirement for escrow. 9 times out of 10 of late, I haven't had any escrow requirements, but they've been not like $46 million projects. I'm anticipating we will get some escrow requirements from banks for that project. But normally we would hold it in our trust account, and then in conjunction with the body corporate committee, we would invest it in term deposits to make sure that we were getting the most interest we possibly could off that money for them. Some committees will go to investment advisors to see, what's the best way to make the most of this money, so that it's not just dead money sitting in a savings account, for example. And that also helps fund any overruns that you might have on the end of the project. So if you've been getting really good interest over a couple of years and say $20 million, that can be quite substantial, and it can fund any overspend at the end of the project.
At what point of the project do they decide, okay, we need to move everybody out, or we're going to do it in stages, or people can live there, or whatever? I guess it depends on the severity of the project, but do they have to make those decisions prior to, well, even is it a decision that's made at the EGM, or when do they decide those things?
It's generally not a decision that's made by the owners, because it's the owners who decide things at an EGM. It's a decision that's made by the contractors. And whether or not they have to empty a building could be a health and safety issue. So sometimes they stage them depending on the construction of the project. So if it's sort of a lot of side-by-side places, it's easy to stage. But if it's a 15-storey building, for example, where only got a couple of lifts and everybody's got to use the lifts, the contractors and the people, it's generally you would empty the building for the time of the project. And how do you decide? Well, it depends how many units you've got and how much parking you've got, how many moving trucks you can get in, how many lifts you've got to facilitate the exit from the building.
Yeah, because it becomes a construction site, and it's a totally different kettle of fish then. What about insurance at that during a project? You'd have to have like construction insurance and all that sort of thing, or is that left up to the main contractor to arrange?
Well, contractors have their own liability insurance, obviously, and you wouldn't take anybody on that didn't. But as far as the body corporate's concerned, we continue with their normal building insurance, because there are still items within the building that obviously are going to need insurance. But we also have contract works insurance in place for the duration of the project, and the cost of the contract works is generally determined by the cost of the project.
Okay, that's cool. So you've talked about the funding, obviously the start of the project, and as it works through, and I guess it depends on how if there's still people there, then there's still a building to be managed, there's still people to be managed. If there's no people there, then it kind of makes it a little bit more straightforward. But then you come to the pointy end of the project when it's nearly finished. Do you guys have any sort of further input at that point, or does the project just run and then all of a sudden it just stops, or how does it all wrap up at the end there?
Generally, we would keep owners informed the whole way through the project. So by way of newsletters or whatever, you can still hold your AGMs because you've still got to raise money to keep the building functioning. So you've still got lift inspections and certain costs that pertain to the building normally.
Does the BWAF go on hold during that time?
Depends on the severity of the project and how much they're working on, but there's
unlikely
certain
that it
areas of it that won't.
Yeah, because there's still fire systems in the building. There's still 12As that need to be attended to.
Yeah, lift, access doors, those types of things. They carry on.
Yeah.
Most of the work, to be fair, in a remediation process, even when all the owners have moved out, like I think I said last time I was here, most of our work comes from people. It's not often the building, and even when the building creates the work in this situation, once it gets off and it's on the railway track of getting repaired, then there's still the same amount of, if not more, email correspondence from owners wanting to understand things better, not understanding the updated newsletter, wanting broken down more. So would you say, Wendy, that to be honest, the emails are, I know what you're going to say because you tell me, but will the emails reduce or increase?
Well, it depends how well you keep people informed, but to be fair, it doesn't really matter how well you inform people, it's how well they listen. So, I mean, the one project that I've talked about a little bit today, the big project, it's been on the go for 4 years now. We've had about 3 EGMs. We've had, I can't count the number of owner information evenings. An amazing committee. They put out monthly newsletters, keeping people informed. I got an email the other day from somebody who'd owned in the building since 2017.
So
Why do our tenants have to move out? They said the building has to be emptied. What's going on? I'm like, are you serious? You've had 4 years now of information. They had no idea the building was defective.
Wow, that's kind of stunning, isn't it? You can lead a horse to water, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, it's one of those sorts of things.
It's information overload. People get these emails. People don't have time to read these emails. That's the issue with that person. He or she has just gone information overload.
They just have to. They just have to take responsibility. It's their property. It's and this is what amazes me sometimes about owners, particularly absentee owners. As long as they're garnering their rent, they're quite happy. They don't actually care. But as soon as it affects them in the pocket, they're like, they won't read a newsletter, but you send them an invoice. It's like, what? I can suddenly read this thing.
Same with
It's
AGM.
when it attacks their wallet, people take notice. That's when I take notice.
Yeah. Same with AGM attendance. Like, you get, if you get a decent crowd at an AGM, it's usually because there's an issue.
Yep.
Sometimes it's hard to get quorum when there's when everything's sort of ticking along quite nicely. I guess.
We were laughing about that today. About not getting a quorum at a body corporate, and I said, well, that's because owners have such faith in you that they don't feel they need to attend. Everything's running so smoothly. When things go balls up, then people turn up.
Or you'll turn up at a meeting, you'll have a handful of proxies to the body corporate manager because nobody's interested. They know things are going
If it's
well.
well managed.
Yeah.
So once the project's done and dusted, how do you find the mood of people? Is it generally a whole lot better, or if like people moved on? Like physically and sort of mentally, like what are people like after a huge remediation project on the committees, for example?
Some are relieved. Some are worried that it hasn't been done right. Generally, you'll get a plethora of emails about small things.
Right.
There's stains on my carpet. My sink plug doesn't fit. So when they first come back in, it's a super busy time. It's a great time to have a good building manager, Brady.
Yeah, we get it a lot in these projects.
That's a huge time, and people are burnt. They're tired. They've been out of the building for a couple of years, sometimes more. They've paid out all this money. They're hurting. They've got big mortgages, and they're just ready to pick on anything. And seriously, who can blame them? I mean.
But why do they come to you guys with that sort of stuff? It should either be, it shouldn't even be the building manager really. If there's like construction defects after the project, it should be like a project manager or someone from the construction company that does all that sort of thing.
You're always the conduit. You know what it's like. I mean, you're the people they see. You're the ones that are the face of the AGMs. You're walking around the buildings. You're, sweeping. You're fixing things. You're doing whatever. all of their invoices come from us, their communication comes from us. We're the names they know, and we're the people they feel confident in going to. So
Yeah. I guess the most well-known one is like the leaky building thing, right? So that's always the big sort of, when people hear about defects or weather tightness issues, it sort of always goes back to that. But do you guys have many buildings that have had issues with like passive fire protection? Because that's a massive issue as well. Like not being done properly back in the day.
Yeah. Oh,
You're looking at me.
everyone's looking at me.
Yeah, passive fire's horrible, and
Pacifier,
it
yeah.
can absolutely blow projects completely out of the water. I had one a few years ago, and it was an issue building. It definitely had issues. It had leaks running down the lifts, etc., etc. But as soon as we got a building condition report done, they identified passive fire right the way through. So it just hadn't been built correctly, and it actually got to the stage where the building wasn't fixable anymore, because it really meant that they were just going to get down to a shell. They had to rebuild the entire inside of the building, and that's huge. And the other one's EQC. So, your earthquake-prone buildings. There's lots of issues at the moment.
That's an interesting one where you say, they basically have to rebuild it. It's like, at what point do they make that decision just to run a bulldozer through it and say, let's start again? Because quite sure often that might be an easier way to go about it. When you have to retrofit a building, there must be various challenges with that sort of thing.
Well, banks won't lend the money. I mean, unless they can see a return at the end, or know that the unit's not going to be in negative equity. I mean, why would you loan money on something where you're going to have the owner's not going to own anything? I mean, they're just going to be in negative equity. So those are the things that have to be taken into consideration. That particular building, the developer had taken the fire rating up, but between the top of the ceiling and the next unit, there was no fire rating. So every single wall in that building, including the internal jib walls to the external part of the building, everything had to be replaced.
Yeah.
And it wasn't worth doing. I mean, I think the building's still, operating at the moment, but I've lost touch with that one, but I know it was massive.
That's another thing that you hear quite often, is that once they start these projects, they find another issue, and it's like that whole can of worms scenario where they're like, oh god, we'll take this panel off, and oh shit, there's another issue. There's like rot or bloody, there's it's just it's a real minefield, when they start getting into defects and building issues and things like that. That's where I really feel sorry for a lot of these owners, and that's how these things blow out, I guess. They don't know what they don't know until they start taking panels off and removing ceilings, and they're like, oh shit, this is a lot worse than what we thought.
That's why I say, you do as much work as you can at the start, because it's like peeling an onion. The more layers you take off, the more you find. It just keeps on going. So if you've done that work at the start, hopefully there's only a tiny wee bit of the onion left to peel by the time you start the job. But it's the ones where you've got perhaps something that's fallen off a building, and so it's a health and safety issue, so they push it through really quickly, and then it just mushrooms, and the owners have got no control over it anymore. It's it becomes a health and safety thing, then it becomes a building issue thing, then it becomes a passive fire thing, and they weren't ready for it. They were moved out really quickly. There wasn't enough work done at the start because they had to start it quickly, and those ones are really, they're a disaster waiting to happen.
An onion's a bloody good way to describe it, I guess. Both of them, the remediation and an onion, would make your eyes water with the fees and the cost involved. Do you get many people that say, oh, while this is going on, could we just renovate this or add this? Or are people allowed to do that? In their apartments, or in their own apartment? While the building's being remediated, they want their kitchen changed or something inside their apartment. Allowed to do that?
Yep, they can. But it's something that they need to negotiate independently with the contractors. It's not something that we would generally want to bring into the scope of the remediation. So it's at their own cost. It's betterment. Often there'll be a contract outside of the main contract to do that work for them.
Okay. Yeah, hell of a subject, eh? Like it's
a scary one.
Yeah.
I think the thing to remember is that the huge majority of buildings in New Zealand built very well.
Yeah.
And you can have a good developer or a bad developer, and they can get caught out, especially with passive fire, because you're relying on the council inspections. The council inspector is relying on the fire rating company to do all the collars, make sure all the jib runs all the way up and that sort of stuff. But a body corporate building is so complex, multi-leveled, that things can get missed. But it's the exception rather than the rule. But obviously the buildings that have passive fire issues are the ones that make newspapers. Newspapers don't report good news; they always report bad news, because that's what they've got a business to run, and that is to sell a newspaper.
And
So-
they may well have been built to code at the start.
Yeah, absolutely.
They've
And-
changed the code,
Yeah.
with a lot of these things. So as soon as you start on a project,
Yeah.
they've got to be brought up to the current building code.
Yes.
And that can add quite a bit of cost.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.